You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 21st of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme, the path is clear for Mark Rutte to become the next leader of the Nato military alliance. We'll profile the Dutch Prime Minister and look at how the job has changed under current Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg's watch. We'll also look at what's on the agenda for Hungary Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's visit to Berlin. And after that,
I think there was a lot more buy-in to the proposition that we need to expunge the cult of war, and the only way that we resolve troubles in the future is peace.
a look back at last weekend's Ukraine Peace Summit through the eyes of two of its Australian participants. We'll also head to Slovakia, where Parliament has struck down the country's public broadcaster. And finally, as football takes hold on the European continent, we hear how the championship prompts another frenzy, citizens reclaiming their cities and turning public spaces into temporary living rooms. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. The NATO Western Military Alliance has been brought into sharp focus over the past few years with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, prompting European nations to boost defense spending, NATO to add new members, protect its borders, and come to Ukraine's aid, both financially and militarily. NATO's resurgence has also put its Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, at the forefront of discussions about European defense, but his 10-year term is about to come to an end. This week, the last hurdles were removed for his replacement, the outgoing Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, to be formally approved as his successor at a NATO summit in Washington next month. Well, let's get more on this now with Elizabeth Braw, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a columnist for foreign policy. Elizabeth, great to have you on the show. Give us, first of all, your impressions of Jens Stoltenberg. He has been in the job for 10 years, but it's a job and a presence of his, I suppose, that has changed quite dramatically.
Yes, and there is a reason he has been on the job for 10 years. He's been very good at it. You don't get a 10-year term as Secretary General of NATO. You get a much shorter term in the first instance. And if the member states like you may be renewed or get a renewal. And that's what happened with Stoltenberg. He was renewed several times. And most recently, he was renewed simply because they couldn't think of anybody else who would do their job better than him. And it has become an extremely difficult job to do. So he was just very good. But I mean, you can't go on having just one SecGen in perpetuity. So they did know that this year they would need to find somebody else. And that's what has happened.
Well, to that point then, Elizabeth, tell us about Mark Rutte. What did get him the job that before him nobody thought they had, a solution? There was nobody else to replace Jens Stoltenberg.
Yeah, Mark Rutte he's well respected. He has been around for a long time. He's also very good at navigating a tricky coalition building situation. So he has obviously been the head of a coalition himself in the Netherlands for a very long time, and including parties, coalitions involving parties that didn't really get along that much. And so he's very good at that. He is also somebody who has enormous knowledge of political institutions simply by virtue of having been around for so long as prime minister. And he is generally well liked. Nobody dislikes him. I mean, it's also the case that not many NATO member states are totally in love with him, but you don't need to love the SecGen. You just need to have somebody who can do the job to the general satisfaction of the members, and he is that man. We should remember that newer NATO member states, so Central and Eastern European NATO member states, thought it's time for one of their politicians to get the job, but that was never really going to fly because they are seen as much more strident and much more likely to want to push NATO in a let's say more assertive direction, and that would not sit well with a number of other NATO member states. So he is the consensus candidate.
He is the consensus candidate, and he's going to, as you suggest there, have a lot of work to do to perhaps maintain this coalition between the Eastern members and Western members. I do wonder in that sense if you could talk about the politics of this job. Is it primarily a political job of maintaining a coalition? It is sort of notable in that sense that he was not a defense minister, he's not a military man, but then neither was Jens Stoltenberg and predecessors before him. Is the primary job of the NATO Secretary General politically keeping this alliance afloat?
Yes, and that is really the irony of this job, that is so military, so military in nature. It is that most of the work you do is not really about military capabilities. It's about keeping this alliance together. There are so many different kinds of countries, and they do have to reach an agreement. You can't just have some NATO member states saying we need to take this position while other member states want to take a completely different position. You have to show unity, or otherwise NATO is toothless as an alliance. So it's not just about showing unity if and when war were to break out. It's about showing unity and showing that you have a plan long before there is war. Because if you show such unity, then Russia or indeed any other country that may wish to attack NATO, they will be forced to think twice and conclude that it would be very foolish to attack NATO. So that's what you have to do. And that's what Jens Stoltenberg did so well, whereas some other previous NATO Secretary Generals have been a little bit, I think, more on the prima donna side and wanted to make their own point. Being NATO Secretary is about representing the views of the alliance, and as a result, making it seem strong. And before you represent those views and present those views, you have to make sure that those views are reached by the NATO member states. So you don't have very much power to decide where NATO goes, but you do have a lot of power as the representative of NATO vis-a-vis the world, and the person who has to really convince Russia or maybe increasingly China that they should not mess with NATO.
Just finally then on that and sort of the messaging, if you will, of the role, what has Mark Rutte said specifically about Ukraine and the possibility of it joining NATO? Is that something that, while it's sort of been, held out as something going on in the future, could that actually happen under his watch?
It could happen under his watch, but not because he would be pushing for it. He represents a consensus view, which is that Ukraine may well be invited to join NATO at one point in the future, but now is not the time to talk about that. And that makes him different from a number of Central and Eastern European politicians who have said that they definitely want to invite Ukraine now. And that's a position that America strongly disagree with. And we should remember that Mark Rutte big breakthrough in this race to become SecGen was when the Americans said that they would back him. That essentially meant that he was by far the strongest candidate to get the job, and that's what has come to pass.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. That was Elizabeth Braw. Now here's Monocle's Carlotta Ribello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Israeli forces have stepped up their bombardment across Gaza and have engaged in close-quarter combat with Hamas fighters and residents. The IDF fired from planes, tanks and ships off the coast, forcing a new wave of displacement. At the same time, Palestinian health officials say at least 12 Palestinians have been killed in separate IDF airstrikes. Violent clashes between police and protesters in Nairobi have erupted as the government votes on a controversial finance bill. The bill includes proposed tax hikes despite the nation struggling with soaring living costs. After facing backlash earlier in the week, the Kenyan parliament amended the legislation, but demonstrators say it is not enough. And the Canadian actor Donald Sutherland, the star of MASH and The Hunger Games, has died aged 88 following a long illness. Sutherland had nearly 200 credits to his name in a career spanning more than 50 years. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Carlotta. Hungary's Viktor Orbán is in Berlin today for talks with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. It's a follow-up meeting of sorts after the two leaders were spotted together earlier this week for Germany's Euro 2024 matchup with Hungary in Stuttgart. The two leaders will have plenty to talk about, not least because Hungary is due to take over the rotating presidency of the European Council, a particularly eyebrow-raising move given Orbán's repeated clashes with Brussels in recent years. Well, let's get the latest now with Justin Spike, who is AP's Hungary correspondent. Justin, what is on the agenda for Viktor Orbán himself on this trip to Berlin?
Thank you. I think that Orbán's trip to Germany, in addition to being in order to see the European Championship match between Germany and Hungary as a big football fan, but also to try to assert some of his power on the European stage following European Union elections. His Fidesz party won the most seats out of all the other Hungarian parties in the European Parliament, albeit with a bit of a drop in support from previous elections. They'd not performed so poorly in a European election in 20 years. But at the same time, Orbán saw that as a clear mandate to take he and his party's politics to the European level. And I'm speaking here about their positions on migration, very anti-immigration government. They would like to enlarge the EU to include some countries in the Western Balkans, including Serbia and Macedonia, and also to assert some of his views on the war in Ukraine. He's accused a lot of European leaders of being, quote unquote, pro-war for their support for Ukraine in its war against Russia, and he hopes to exert some influence in that area as well.
Well, it's interesting as you describe the European elections there. Olaf Scholz himself, by comparison, faced a massive setback in those elections for his Social Democratic Party. I do wonder if that makes you feel like, Orbán has the upper hand, as it were, in these talks. Or where do you expect Olaf Scholz to push back against some of Orbán's priorities?
I think that while Olaf Scholz and his party performed rather poorly in the elections in Germany, that doesn't necessarily mean that on the broader pan-European level, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, or the European People's Party, for that matter, the center-right, have lost much ground. Now, it's true that the populist far-right parties performed better than usual in these elections, especially in places like France. But it wasn't enough to sort of move aside the more traditional parties having control of European institutions. And I think we see that the EPP is going to be able to secure some top jobs for itself in the composition of the next cycle in Europe. And I think Orbán, he's said directly that they're ignoring the will of the European people. He saw the vote as a mandate, not just in Hungary, but across all of Europe, that people desire more anti-immigration policies. And he thinks that the composition of the new European Union is going to be against voter will. But I don't see that as being necessarily true when you look at the numbers and you see that they simply do have a majority of these traditional, more mainstream parties within the European Parliament.
Now, this meeting with Olaf Scholz comes after Jens Stoltenberg also visited Hungary. I do just wonder then why this sort of quite aggressive, one could argue, courtship of Hungary and Orbán at the moment. Is there some kind of recognition that, however difficult this relationship has been, that his approval is needed for the EU and NATO to move forward?
I think so. In the past several years, Hungary has really played the role of spoiler in a lot of different cases within the EU, specifically when it comes to passing aid packages to Ukraine, passing EU sanctions on Moscow for its war, and also in admitting Sweden and Finland, the two newest member countries, into NATO. And I think that politicians in the European Union, as well as officials in NATO, see that Hungary is a member of both of these organizations, and whether they like it or not, it can exert veto power on any number of issues. And so I think there's a balancing act going on, trying to make sure that Hungary, a country of 10 million people, is unable to exert such oversized power when it comes to taking important decisions, while at the same time trying not to alienate Orbán further, because he's well known as Russian President Vladimir Putin's closest ally in the European Union. And I think for years there's been a fear that marginalizing him and his government too much could push him further into the arms of Putin and Russia.
Justin Spike from AP, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. Now, while most of the countries that attended last weekend's Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland sent a prime minister, president, or foreign minister, Australia, on the other hand, sent its Minister for Government Services, although he was, in fairness, once leader of Australia's currently governing Labour Party between 2013 and 2019. Bill Shorten spoke to Monocle Radio's other Australian, Andrew Muller, at the summit. Andrew began by asking him what the actual discussions between officials had been like so far.
I have to say I'm incredibly impressed. The whole of Europe would go the distance with Ukraine. I understand why the Poles and Moldova and the Baltics would, and Finland, but I'm very impressed by the depth of commitment to Ukraine. What was also impressive was the buy-in from countries outside of Europe. The fact is, Ghana and Kenya, Argentina and Chile. Really important that Turkey was there. Indonesia, India sent observers, Japan, Korea, I guess ourselves and our Kiwi brothers and sisters. There was a lot of... I was impressed by the depth of resolve and the core issue being, and I think the Singaporean senior minister put it best to me, this is about territorial sovereignty. And I won't put words in her mouth, but it was about, for nations, we accept that we have the rule of law, and what that means practically is big countries can't invade small countries, annex, invade, rape, murder, and that there's a recognition amongst countries who don't like each other that this is a red line.
I did want to ask about the view of this crisis from Australia. 2 years and more into it, this is obviously happening a long way away from Australia. Do you get the sense that it has receded from the Australian consciousness generally?
Probably, and that's not a negative reflection on us. We've got cost of living challenges, that's where the government's head's at. You know, we've got housing pressures, but Australians are more sophisticated than, you know, perhaps others think. Yes, for our citizens, get on top of cost of living. That's the priority, 1, 2, right through to 10. Well, I think there is a deeper understanding when you scratch the surface that Australia's an island. We're uniquely fortunate to occupy an entire continent. But Australia is more than an island because Australia is linked to all other countries through our humanity. So, yeah, I'd say Australians, I think people can understand the argument that if Russia was to succeed and Ukraine to fail, that it would be a bell tolling for the whole world, and we understand that their illegal invasion of Ukraine threatens all nations. So I don't think Australians need to be told for whom the Ukrainian bell tolls. We're focused on making ends meet in Australia and cost of living, but there is a principle here that when one country can simply invade another country, that's a bell tolling for all of us.
You will be familiar with the criticisms and discussions that have gone on around Australia's involvement in this conference, that the Prime Minister's not here, that the Foreign Minister's not here. When you come to an event like this, does it seem to you that possibly even because of Australia's unique, in fact, geographical and political situation, Australia could be playing a bigger role in international fora?
Oh, I don't accept the initial proposition of the question. The Premier of China is in Australia. That was set up. The reality is that China's our major trading partner. We've got to focus on that. That's in our economic and security interests. Being a former leader is not something I'd wish on anyone, but I'm a former leader of the party for 6 years, and the Prime Minister thought someone of my seniority would be good, and he also knows that ever since the shocking murderous shoot-down of MH17, where I was leader of the party, and we worked with the government of the day in a bipartisan fashion. We met with President Poroshenko. I've maintained a strong interest in issues which affect Ukraine, and my constituency is the centre, has the head office of the associations for Australians of Ukrainian heritage. And I certainly don't think it's anything in terms of a diminution of attention. We're one of the biggest non-NATO contributors, fact one. Our Prime Minister has been to Ukraine, fact two. Our Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister have been to Ukraine, fact three. Foreign Minister Wong has raised this matter in international fora, fact four. And we intend to go on supporting Ukraine. I noticed that India had an observer. I noticed that Korea had a senior minister, but not a foreign minister. I noticed Singapore had a minister here. Like the Indonesians had their ambassador. I just want to say to anyone who's concerned about Australian commitment, judge us by our actions, and hopefully anyone reading this interview will show the depth of our interest.
Well, just finally then, there has been a lot of talk from the beginning of this. Certainly when President Zelensky spoke to the media yesterday, he was very clear that he sees this as only the first part of a process. What would you anticipate or what would you hope for from whatever step 2 is? And at what point do you think Russia does need to be involved a little bit more directly?
I don't think the Russians will take my advice, so I won't offer it to them. I think the nations here, some are more supportive of Ukraine than others, but I think all of them will have left here saying, okay, that was a serious gathering of 100 plus international organisations and nations. I think the conversation will happen in 2 parts. One is with other countries not here, and 2, the support's got to keep happening to Ukraine. The Russians will come to the table when they have to and not beforehand, but in the meantime the thinking's got to be done. The strategic framework's got to be done. I think there was a lot more buy-in to the proposition that we need to expunge the cult of war, and the only way that we resolve troubles in the future is peace, and any other option is unacceptable. The nuclear threats are unacceptable, the using of nuclear power systems to be weaponised, or civil power systems to be weaponised, the kidnapping of the children, food security. I think there was more commonality, but it does return to what I said at the outset. We need to ensure that the basic principle we learned since the Second World War, and it hasn't always been honoured in the breach, big neighbours don't attack small neighbours, countries don't annex other parts of other countries. We respect the right of a country to live securely within its own borders, that we respect the right of a country to defend itself, respect the right of a country to pick their own leadership and to pick their own relationships. President Zelensky and all the Ukrainians we met with here are very grateful for the Australian contribution.
Bill Shorten there in conversation with Monocle's Andrew Muller. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Yesterday in Bratislava, the Slovak parliament voted for a bill that aims to take control of the country's public broadcaster RTVS, dissolving the organization in its current format and replacing it with a body that is controlled more closely by the government. It is a decision that prompted opposition parties, along with various journalists and civil society groups, to declare the 20th of June a black day for public service. Well, I'm joined now with more on this by Rob Cameron, journalist based in Prague, who covers the region. Rob, how contested, first of all, was this vote yesterday? Was there any doubt about it?
There was not, no. There are 150 MPs in Slovakia's parliament, and it was backed by 78 government lawmakers, and the opposition MPs, in fact, walked out of the parliament before the vote. So now that was the third reading. So the parliamentary process has essentially finished, and now it goes to the newly inaugurated President Peter Pellegrini to sign it, which he's expected to do. And once he's done that, then it will come into effect on July the 1st.
Now, Rob, we spoke about this about 10 days ago on this show, the protests and fears sort of ahead of this vote. I wonder if the final version looked in any way different from what was being planned 10 years ago. Was there any listening to what either the public broadcaster or opposition groups were saying about it?
Not really, no. They've sort of steamed ahead. I think there has been a sense, certainly, that the government of Robert Fico has, in a sense, been, in a way, politically given not free rein, but certainly has been given a sense that it has a license now to proceed with these changes following that failed assassination attempt on Robert Fico on May the 15th. The opposition certainly, I think, is in a rather defensive position. There have been protests against this bill, both, as you say, within the broadcaster with journalists protesting, but also in the public sphere as well. But I think certainly the government feels emboldened to make this change. It should be stressed that the minister who's responsible for it, the culture minister, Martina Šimkovičová, she said that the goal would be to strengthen the public law character of Slovakia's broadcaster and ensure respect for plurality and the principles of democracy, in her words. But obviously that's not the way the opposition sees it, and they're worried that the TV station, radio station, under much tighter control of the government with a new director general, will be free to spread pro-government propaganda and perhaps also allow a great tide of various views, even esoteric views, on air that will drown out criticism, objective criticism of this government.
Well, tell us a little more then, Rob, about, given those differing characterizations, what exactly this means for the public broadcaster, what this new body, the STVR, will look like, and also who will be a part of it. There are also, of course, naturally questions about which journalists will actually stay, whether certain journalists will go. I mean, how much of the character of this will change?
It will change, perhaps not overnight, but I think it will change quite quickly. For a start, the current director, Luboš Machaj, he will lose his job immediately. So he'll wake up on July the 1st without a job. And then it'll be run, I think, by one of his deputies as a sort of preliminary transition period until they can appoint, until this new board can appoint a new director general. But of course, many people will leave because many of the top journalists, both on air and off air, the producers and the editors, and also sound technicians and so on, they've been very prominent in the public demonstrations against this move. And I think it's going to be quite hard for many of them to stay on. They simply, either they won't want to stay, or their new bosses will make life quite uncomfortable for them. So I think there will be a change, and we will, in the beginning at least, see some of the familiar faces and some of the familiar voices on Slovakia's public broadcaster, either withdrawing from the screens because they've left and handed in their resignation, or they've been, taken off air and replaced with other people, or they will be slowly replaced as these changes take effect. So I think there will be a change. The question remains is how quick that change will be.
Rob Cameron, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. We have not taken a leave of our senses here at Monocle Radio. That was from the European Championships, because finally on today's show, the Euro 2024 Championships are not just an opportunity to root for your team, as you heard there. They're also a chance for cities around the continent to show a bit of a different side of themselves, with public viewing spaces sprouting up in towns big and small. Well, I'm joined now by Jessica Bridger, who is Monocle's contributing editor and an urbanism consultant. She joins us today from Klosters in the Swiss Alps. Jessica, thanks very much for taking some time out from Klosters. What has it been like there, where you are, to watch the European Championships?
Thanks, Chris. It's been great. We've seen a lot of different solutions to kind of people's desire to basically watch the games in public with other people. And that has like a really amazing energy all over Switzerland, whether it's up here in the Alps, where in the small village that I'm in, one of the restaurants here has really gone all out, building a little mini tent city with multiple screens, bars, cooking options, because we've had one of the wettest springs on record in Switzerland. Then down in the city in Baden and in Zurich, I've been watching it in public squares where there are huge projector screens set up, and you've got really people from all over coming and watching the games. And by all over, I mean Switzerland's 25% approximate migrant and foreign population. You see who they're rooting for. So it's not just interest in the local Swiss games, but it's interest continent-wide in the whole tournament.
Well, absolutely. There is that whole interest. And I have to say, personally, one of my favorite things is watching, say, European Championships with a group of fans that are not from my country, but seeing the passion of the other fans, whether it's at a restaurant or a bar or in a public space. And I just wonder if you could talk a little more about that, how cities go about accommodating their entire diverse populations. How much effort do cities typically put into this?
I think the effort is really interesting. It's more grassroots. So it's not really coming at the municipal level. It's really an ad hoc process where individual bars and restaurants, sometimes even public spaces and their caretakers, go to the effort to build these public viewing areas, assembling various seating elements, whether that's the traditional German Bierbanke and its benches or just regular seats, and kind of building up screens in all different forms, protected from the weather or not. And this year, because it's been so wet, we've seen a lot of really interesting solutions to how you solve the outdoor desire given heavy or some amount of rainfall.
That's a good point in itself, which does make me wonder as well whether there is some kind of lasting effect from this sometimes. I mean, do cities use this opportunity when they are creating public spaces for football viewing? I mean, is it something that lasts sometimes in a city, these creative elements that you're speaking of, whether it's to deal with the rain or other aspects of just bringing a huge amount of people together?
Sadly, I don't think that there's a one-to-one relationship there, but often, more broadly, temporary public spaces have led to more lasting and permanent public space provision. There's actually a good example in Baden where something that was built for Baden's Badenfahrt, which is a temporary urban festival that happens every 5 to 10 years, built a Flussbad, so like a kind of a riverside bar, an enjoyment area, which then was made permanent because the population loved it so much. They then also show the Euro Cup games. So you see some learning, right, from that grassroots movement of we can build this in our city. We're going to go ahead and do it. Let's see how the public receives it. But I do think on the municipal level, more could be learned from where these spaces pop up and just the broad public interest in getting out there with your fellow city dwellers and watching things or participating in things together. And we're seeing it even in heavy rain here. That's a fundamental thing.
And just finally, Jessica, then to that point about lessons, but also the grassroots effort about this, is that something to be learned from as well? That citizens, restaurants, all these people, they have the opportunity to recreate their cities. It's not something that city officials have to be doing and organizing. I mean, that's also what's kind of incredible about these European championships, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the amount of creativity you see and the amount of flexibility or just license that restaurants, bars, public spaces, or the facilitators take is really amazing and is something that just is a testament to urban will as a collective effort and not necessarily as something that needs to be legislated or put through in a more top-down way. That said, there could be more exchange, and I would love to see that.
Jessica Bridger, thank you very much for joining us. We'll let you get back to the public viewing in Cloisters. That's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Carlotta Ribello. Our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio managers were Steph Chungu and Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, have a good weekend, and thanks for listening.